Okay, so Neill, getting cramps on the bike doesn't mean I've run out of magnesium. I need more magnesium. That's what I used to think. Tell me, why do cyclists get cramps on bikes?
All right, mate, complicated subject. Some of these,
You've got notes. What's going on?
I've actually got notes for this one, a full page.
How
There's
dare you?
lots of big words in here that
Yeah, okay.
I don't deal well with, Cam, so I've actually written some of this down. Cramps, we'll talk about two things, general cramps and the different types of cramps versus positionally induced cramps. The positionally induced ones are easy. It means there's something wrong with the bike position of the rider, and one muscle group, usually just one muscle group, is getting overloaded and therefore fatiguing more rapidly and cramping. We'll talk about, first of all, what cramps are. So the way that your muscles work is that there's millions and thousands and millions of small overlapping fibers, muscle spindles, which basically slide across each other using these little electrochemical bridges, which allow them to shorten or lengthen under load or not under load. And that sliding kind of, geometry is what allows your muscles to shorten or lengthen under load. And the key thing here is that it's an electrochemical system, right? So it's your body is very electrical, and this is just one of the components that's electrical. Cramp is basically an involuntary muscle contraction involving an overly exuberant nerve that's firing constantly, telling the muscle to contract in an uncontrolled fashion. As far as the research goes about how this occurs, I'll tell you things we know. We know that about 80% of cramps occur in people's calves. We know that there's different types of cramps. There's the ones that you get in the middle of the night when you're just lying in bed, asleep usually, and your heart's beating slowly, the circulation to your legs is moving really slowly. Something happens, the bed sheets point your foot down, the muscle spindle shortens up, and you leap out of bed. So there's those ones which tend to affect, they can affect athletes who are training really hard, but they're more common in things like pregnancy. Like the later you get into your pregnancy, the more inclined you are to get those. Vascular problems like chronic pulmonary disease and issues where the circulation to the lower legs is starting to become compromised. It means that the metabolites and the things that the muscle needs to function normally can't get down to your calves because it's so far away from your heart. It's the first muscle group to start having its delivery of those things curtailed when your heart's beating really slowly. And if you're taking a lot of EPO and your hematocrit's 55%,
yes,
and your resting heart rate in the middle of the night is 30 beats.
I've been wondering
per minute.
about this one.
If you're a pro cyclist in the early 90s on the Festina team, your blood is thicker than cold honey, and so it can't. It's beating. Your heart's beating really slowly because there's so many oxygen cells in there. It doesn't need to be real quick, and so these guys would often sleep with heart rate monitors on, and leap out of bed if their heart rate gets too low, and run around the room to get it back up. So cramps can occur in the middle of the night from a lack of various things getting to the muscle. The sports cramps that you see, what we call exercise-induced muscle cramps, we know that heat increases the risk of cramping. So hot days, you're more likely to cramp. We also know that the primary cause seems to be overexertion outside of your training stimulus. So if you're undertrained for the event that you're in, let's say you've been doing a lot of zone 2 training, steady state stuff, training for a triathlon, and then you go into a crit with lots of surges and neuromuscular efforts. The more different the game day is, I guess, to your training, the more likely you are to cramp. So it's a really good advertisement for race-specific training. Because cramp, as you saw perhaps watching the Road Nats on the weekend, poor old Kel cramping in a sprint, after doing the ride of the day, like the guy was on fire, and it was cramp that stopped him in the end, So perhaps if he'd been able to train more specifically to exactly match the demands of the race day, he'd be less likely to cramp. The amateurs and people like myself do this much more often. We find it very difficult to replicate race situations, whereas the serious guys who are racing a lot, racing becomes part of the training stimulus, so that their bodies are more well adapted to racing and neuromuscular efforts and that sort of stuff. One of the key takeaways from the exercise-induced cramps is that it's surprisingly not well understood. It's a very difficult thing to study because you need to maybe biopsy someone's muscles while they're cramping. So imagine signing up for that study.
No thanks.
We're going to exercise you until you cramp, then we're going to stick needles in the muscles that are cramping,
Yes.
and take some biopsies. Or we're going to do an EMG study while you're cramping. Like, the pain is horrible.
Yes.
You don't want to be sitting there with, like EMG pads on your leg while it's cramping. Yeah, just take your time, guys.
Yes.
So very difficult to study and therefore not well understood. It appears that there's multiple types and causes of cramps. Lack of circulation to the muscle belly, which are those ones in the middle of the night, and also if the muscle is really getting overloaded, that seems to be one of the causes as well, is that when it's contracting really hard, really aggressively for long periods, the circulation can't get to the muscle spindles. So you get insufficient delivery of metabolites to the muscle itself. It's very strong. In the last 5 years, we've figured out that there's probably some of the etiology is involved with these things called reflex arcs at spinal cord level. So it may be essentially a fatiguing of the reflex arc, and I won't explain exactly what reflex arcs are, but essentially a depletion of neurotransmitters and a nerve fatigue at spinal cord level, where the nerves come out that control the muscles in the legs in our case. Neurotransmitter depletion seems to be part of it, and the critical thing to take away is that we know that it's not electrolytes.
Right, okay.
It's not magnesium,
Yeah.
It's not lack of salt, it's not these things. The research is really clear on that. That doesn't seem to make any difference. Okay. So if you're dramatically dehydrated, it probably does increase your risk, but we're talking about subtle depletions in the sodium or something. Not the case. So the newest research tends to point towards these neurological causes, the neurotransmitter depletion, the uncontrolled reflex arcs, and very complex to describe, and in fact, very complex to understand even if you're a neuroscientist. So we won't go into the details. Now, in terms of causation or positional causes, if you're trained well, you're hydrated well, you've done all the right things, and you get cramp when you're riding or racing. If it's occurring everywhere in your legs at once, let's say, I was a chronic cramper in races, and I figured out after many, many seasons of racing, the problem was not that the race was hard, it was the fact that I was stopping and starting pedaling often. In a surgy bunch of 100 riders in a VRS race, for example, you would stop pedaling for 5 seconds as the bunch slowed, and then you'd accelerate again, and then you'd stop. And the stop-start was the problem for me, not the wattage, not the fatigue. Because when I was training, I was never stopping pedaling. I would go out solo and do massive rides in the hills and training in intervals, but you're always on the pedals. You very rarely stop and then start again. Stop, start, stop, start, stop, start. And that was the training stimulus. I guess that was the thing that I was missing in my training, which was making me cramp in the races. And it took me a long time to figure that out, because I thought I was doing the wrong things. The wattages were too high, I was too fatigued. And one day I cramped in a road race after an hour and a half when I'd done nothing. I'd been just sitting in a bunch averaging 100 watts doing nothing, and I cramped, and I thought, something's wrong here. And it turns out it was the stop-start for me, which was the problem, which points towards more a neurological cause for me. And when I cramped, I would first go in one hamstring and then the other hamstring, and then if I stood up, my quads would go or my calves would go. So it was all over. When it happens all over, it means that it's one of those training stimulus, depletion of neurotransmitter type things, and you've got to look at that as your cause. A lot of my riders will come in and say, Neill, I cramp in my calves when I'm going really hard, or I cramp in my right quad, only in my VMO, like the medial quad, or something like a focal area that always cramps. Now that's different. That means that there's a problem with their position, which is overloading the muscle belly or the nerve that controls that muscle. In other words, the muscle is doing far too much work in a positional sense for the rider. So we'll take the example of the calves. Let's say that the rider's seat is really high and their cleat position is too far forward, and they're overusing their calf to try and reach through the bottom of the stroke, and the calf is getting into a really shortened position regularly at the bottom of the stroke, and it's working twice as hard as it otherwise would be if the seat wasn't too high. Their calves will cramp when they get really fatigued first. So the solution is a positional solution. You move the cleats further back, you lower the seat, the calves are not getting murdered, and therefore the cramps won't occur. If they're occurring, once again, if they're occurring all over, all at once, you're good. It means your position is good. There's not focal fatigue anywhere. Let's say that, I guess probably the second most common area of cramping for riders on a bike is the VMOs, the medial section of the quadricep. It's got complex causes. Sometimes it's caused by the Q factor being too narrow. So you've got a rider whose knees are going like this. The VMOs will get overloaded trying to control the kneecap as it's tracking down. And instead of getting knee pain, they'll get quad cramps because the knees are moving outside the line of the pedal. So in that situation, a wider Q factor is the cause. Recently, I came across a rider who was getting really bad VMO pains and cramps because his cleat position was too far forward. And that took us quite a while to figure it out because it wasn't obvious. Right. He was getting poor hamstring engagement across the bottom of the stroke because the cleats were too far forward, which was overloading his VMOs, and he was cramping in his VMOs. So we tried all this logical stuff and his cramps didn't go away, and then we tried moving his cleats further back as a test, and lo and behold, the cramps got better. So those things tend to, if they're happening focally, they tend to indicate a positional problem. And I guess the big one that you'll come across there'll be two things. The person's calves or their VMOs will be cramping. If it's the VMOs, look to the Q factor, look to the cleat position or the seat being drastically too high, and therefore a lack of hamstring engagement and the quad getting overloaded. If it's the calves, again, typically seat too high or a cleat position that's too far forward, almost always. Yeah. So excessive fatigue in one muscle belly, can cause cramp. And just, sometimes you won't even get cramp. You'll just find that your quads or your calves are just burning up and just hitting lactate threshold really early when you're doing efforts, and that's slowing you down, but they don't cramp. And there's lots of genetic predisposers to this. Some people, no matter how hard you push them, they never cramp. Some people cramp at the drop of a hat, like me, under those specific circumstances. So it can be a real bugger of a thing. Yes. So tick all the boxes. Train according to your race. If you've got a power meter, pull out the data from the power meter and see what's different about the way you're applying force in the race versus on the training efforts. And if it's focal, look to the position.